It's been another violent and deeply troubling week across Trinidad and Tobago. A series of gruesome incidents, including mass killings and shocking acts of violence, have once again rattled communities and heightened national concern about the crime situation. Tonight, we take you beyond the headlines, examining not just what happened, but what's driving this continuing cycle of violence, with insight from international security expert Dr. Ellis. Dr. Ellis has worked on the Secretary of State's policy planning staff with responsibilities for Latin America and the Caribbean, and international narcotics and law enforcement matters. Dr. Ellis, let me thank you so much for joining us here tonight. Dr. Ellis, thank you so much for joining us here tonight. Are you hearing us?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
I'm hearing you loud and clear. So let's get straight into it, Dr. Ellis. We know that you are quite familiar with Trinidad and Tobago. You have had conversations here with us through the United States Embassy. You have had talks, virtual talks, and so on. So welcome back to TNT, even though it's virtual. So
it's good to be back with you. Thank you.
So, Dr. Ellis, Trinidad and Tobago has seen repeated spikes in violent crime. Even during the state of emergency this weekend, we saw a police officer being shot at a police station and more than 100 guns stolen. My first question to you, are states of emergency actually effective, or do they just create temporary illusions of control?
In my opinion, states of emergency can bring temporary relief. They can give certain powers in the short term that help police and other law enforcement get their handle around things, to identify groups, to suppress the violence. But if they're not accompanied by more long-term measures, both with respect to the causes and also to break the cycle of criminality, you can't just have a perpetual state of emergency. But they can help in the midterm if they are accompanied by other types of planning to go forward.
Other types of planning. So let me just break it down. I'm sure you've done your research, but for the benefit of our viewers, the state of emergency has been in place, or on May 2nd, it will be in place for 12 of the 16 months previously. The 2024 murder toll was 626. The 2025 murder toll was 369, and this year to date, the murder toll is 111. Can repetitive states of emergency normalize the effects that we really want to get out of them?
Well, let me try to put this in context. In Trinidad and Tobago, as with other parts of the Caribbean, whether it's Jamaica or even the Turks and Caicos, what you're seeing is an interaction between three things. Number one is the flows of illicit activity, especially narco trafficking. Number two, the difficulties with gang activity. And number three, the access to guns, especially small arms that you see in the Caribbean, much of which unfortunately comes from the United States. And so over the number of years, you've seen that really turn into a plague in many different places. But what you've also seen is, both in Trinidad and Tobago and in other states in the region, such as Jamaica, with the Jamaica Constabulary Force and the Jamaica Defense Force, some efforts targeting communities to begin to make some progress. I would note that, in my opinion, you did see substantial progress under previous state of emergencies, bringing the violence down Trinidad and Tobago almost 40%, as I remember, or at least the murders, to be specifically. Now, notably, with the end of one of the states of emergency in January, you saw a leap in violence again. So it's difficult to say how much of that just responds to the release of the state of emergency and how much of that corresponds to other factors. But at the end of the day, you see some decreased pressure with respect to narco trafficking flows, in part thanks to the expanded U.S. activities in the Caribbean, as well as the activities of President Bisesayer's government. You see also some attempts to address gang activities, although you still have a wide-ranging situation with gangs in different neighborhoods. I believe 180 different gangs, between those who would be affiliated as the Muslim gangs or the Rasta City gangs, cetera, et cetera. And so the underlying issue of the gang structures and the funding of those structures and their access to arms really has not been fully addressed. My sense is there's some progress, so it's difficult to say, okay, when you're able to temporarily clamp down, can you then take advantage of that and move forward with, again, persistent things to address the gangs and local communities and really who has control of those local communities in order to turn a temporary downturn into a permanent downturn. I think that's the challenge in Trinidad and Tobago and elsewhere.
But would you recommend a state of emergency to continue or to be in place for 12 months? That's almost a year. Granted that there would have been periods in between where there was no SOE. 4 months out of the past 16, we did not have an SOE, but 12 of those months there was an SOE. Would you recommend a state of emergency for that prolonged period?
In principle, always a concern with a state of emergency, whether we're talking about El Salvador with Nayib Bukele or elsewhere, is there's always a damage to several liberties. There's always a damage to democratic control. This is not the way things should take place. However, the real question is what is happening behind the scenes in the state of emergency. Is that TTPS or others taking advantage of that in order to be able to address the situation in the gangs, really get the intelligence that it needs to act effectively to reinsert its control over those local communities as alternative to the gang structures to go after the gang source of financing and other things? Or is the state of emergency just a palliative, essentially creating the illusion of control without the underlying causes being addressed? And so theoretically, if you just perpetually do states of emergency one after the other, the indication, if you need to keep doing it, then something to address the underlying problems is not being done.
Now, you did mention other measures or to accompany these states of emergency. Would a curfew be one of those measures, or what are the measures you're really talking about? And I do want to ask you, will the implementation of a curfew, because we have not had one in place during the recent states of emergency, that is to curtail crime, will the implementation of a curfew, in fact, augment the effectiveness of an SOE?
I don't have the precise information with respect to what's going on behind the scenes in the most recent spate of violence. Some of the large-scale incidents, I know, for example, there was the attack on the police station in San Fernando. That type of thing is not something that a curfew necessarily would solve. There are other things where if it's routine crime, if it's just basically keeping youth off the streets at certain times to suppress opportunistic crime, that a curfew can help to address that. So it really depends on what's going on. But when I'm talking about measures, what I'm also talking about is essentially using the reassertion of control over a community to go in and build relationships with the community, begin to provide more effective government services, to begin to get more effective intelligence about who is really calling the shots in those communities, and how do you break some of the more malevolent cycles. So it's that of intelligence and really traditional policing that has to be done using the opportunities that's created by the SOEs. Those are the measures that I'm talking about. But again, a curfew can help. It just really depends on what the nature of the problem actually is that's generating the violence.
Now, let me ask you, government, they have tried to legislate the zones of special operations bill, but they failed. The ZOSO bill is similar as to what pertains in Jamaica. I'm sure you're familiar with that. Is the ZOSO could it be the answer or solution to crime in your point of view?
Well, there's a couple considerations, and even in Jamaica, they wrestled with the ZOSOs for a number of years and had mixed results. One of the problems is if you implement ZOSOs in particular communities but not others, the risk is that you displace the crime to the places that you're not implementing those ZOSOs, or even outside of the perimeter of the places where you implement that. Number two is that if it's not persistent, once you release that military control, because you can't keep effectively military control over a community forever, then you end up bringing that violence back once you relinquish control. So once again, it really comes to the question of what do you do as you use this tool? Are you using the essentially taking of extraordinary measures over a community to rebuild the relationship with the community, to reestablish legitimate government controls and services instead of the structures that gangs have created? Or are you just using this to create the illusion of peace for a while so that when you move away from that, you had the same problem you had before?
You did mention that Jamaica had some teething problems when they first implemented the zoo. So what is their stable model now, or their ideal model?
Again, from the conversations that I've had with some colleagues in the JCF and in JDF, is that initially the limited number of places where the ZOSOs were applied, and again, the lack of addressing the underlying situations meant that when they pulled back, very shortly thereafter, they had essentially the same problems, or they just displaced some of the violence to nearby communities. And so I think what you're seeing now is that ZOSOs can help in some of those problematic communities when it's accompanied by, again, addressing some of the issues of the guns. In the case of Jamaica, also addressing some of the social issues with respect to garrison communities. Again, it comes down to effective policing and understanding the communities to take advantage of those spaces. I think the JCF has gotten better in that. And to be frank, on top of that, you've also seen changes of criminal patterns in the Caribbean that affect Jamaica. So, you had certain disputes that really caused spikes in violence in Jamaica, just as in Trinidad and Tobago, especially Trinidad. You've seen certain spikes that came after the arrest or the killings of certain gang members. And so sometimes it's those scores being settled that, without the police doing anything, give the appearance of making things better. But at the end of the day, it's understanding how you use that tool in coordination with broader good policing, addressing root causes, and again, reestablishing government control and effective services in the communities that are being affected.
So what I'm gathering from you, Dr. Ellis, is that essentially, whether it's the state of emergency or the ZOSO powers, work must be done in the background. So we can't just issue persons preventative detention orders and just lock them up for prolonged periods. We must be doing work, use the state of emergency to enter, search, get those guns off the streets while you can, while it's in place.
Exactly. I mean, any application of force or extraordinary measures, again, is giving you an opening to fix the problems. But at the end of the day, the things that are producing the problems have to do with what's going on with the communities. Trinidad and Tobago, for a number of years, of course, was badly impacted by the influx of desperate Venezuelans. Part of the problem, was to understand what was going on with those communities, with those people at risk, and the people like Trinidad that were exploiting them. In the same aspect, when one looked at some of the gangs and the rivalries between other gangs, whether it was the Muslim gangs, etc., even going back a couple of years, you had issues with really a few radicalized communities and youth that saw certain unfortunate malevolent expressions within a broader, very peaceful Islamic community. And so it was really, how do you get to what's going on in a few difficult places? How do you address those problems? And again, as you mentioned before, the issues of the guns, the issues where in some communities you have the gangs themselves administering public services, or at least work contracts, as we've seen in previous years. You saw the gangs themselves who were, settling disputes, who owed what, and things like that. And so again, you have to get into those communities and within the opportunity that you create through a state of emergency or through the equivalent of ZOSO, in my opinion.
Well, we've really only just begun to unpack the scale and complexity of the crime situation here in TNT, and still to come, we dig deeper into the role of organized networks and whether the state is truly equipped to respond. Stay with us, more Beyond the Headlines with Dr. Evan Ellis after the break.
It's like a heartbeat. It moves to the body, transports your entire being. That's the magic. I just have all these songs in my head.
There's no one like you. And there never will be.
I love you!
FlexiPack continues to be the only producer of high-quality flexible packaging and plastic label solutions in TNT, providing local manufacturers with an alternative to foreign suppliers. With a facility equipped and supported by the world-leading Comexi Group, foreign technical expertise, and locally based production combine to give you the same high-quality packages and labels that you're used to. Today, 99% of wicketed bag requirements are imported, creating risks of delays and shortages. But now, FlexiPack solves that challenge. We're proud to introduce in-house production of wicketed bags, ensuring greater reliability, cost savings, and no more stockouts. Choose FlexiPack. The solution is here.
Thanks for staying with Beyond the Headlines, Dr. Ellis. I have about 6 more questions and about 6 more minutes, so let's see how fast we can get it through. There was a recent partnership with the U.S. to combat narco-terrorism emanating from South America, Venezuela in particular. In your opinion, was this fruitful, or was it simply a cover to extract Nicolas Maduro from Venezuela and affect regime change? Because we've seen as soon as that happened, the U.S. basically left our shores and we're not seeing much activity within the Caribbean basin.
That action, I think, first, in addition to being a extraordinarily, effective, military activity, solved some problems but left others. Certainly, with respect to cocaine flows, predominantly coming from Colombia through Venezuela over to Europe, some of which came through Trinidad and Tobago, but many of which came from Venezuela, going through Hispaniola or going along the coast, along the Guyanese Shield countries. So, certainly the initial presence that you saw intercepting drug boats helped to address some of those flows and the money that came with them, including through places like Trinidad and Tobago. Unfortunately, some of the other flows, as there were fewer flows coming from Colombia and Venezuela to Hispaniola, some of those actually got extended coming through Venezuela, either to Trinidad and Tobago or, again, through countries coming out of Georgetown to Europe or coming out of Paramaribo to Europe. And so there was some displacement, which arguably prejudiced Trinidad and Tobago, especially Trinidad. There were some ways in which it helped. I think also the cooperation, in my opinion, that the Prime Minister President Becerra's government gave was very, very helpful. I think that continuing political support has been helpful. With respect to Nicolas Maduro himself, certainly there has been a increase in cooperation, the reestablishment of some law enforcement activity, but a lot of work still remains to be done. Illegal mining in the Orinoco Basin, the ELN, the Sindicatos, and others are still there. The Venezuelans still have not felt enough liberty or enough solution to the crime problem to start coming back, although the marginal improvement in the economic situation probably has at least avoided a renewed flood of Venezuelans impacting the Caribbean and Trinidad and Tobago. So it's helped in some ways. It's made other problems worse, but I think more broadly, it's, in my judgment, a move in the right direction, because you simply can't have a self-destructing, narco-facilitating, hosting, country, 7 miles from Trinidad and Tobago, right across the Caribbean from the United States. That is creating this problem of instability. So it's incomplete success, but it's I think we're moving in the right direction.
Moving in the right direction. Is there evidence that criminal elements are penetrating legitimate institutions, like the police service, for instance? That incident you referenced over the weekend in San Fernando, where one police officer is alleged to have killed another and steal a cache of guns. How do we combat this threat to national security?
Well, sadly, anytime that you've had substantial narco flows, especially when there have been malleable institutions, you always have the problem of, frankly, public corruption within the police. You see it in Mexico, you see it in El Salvador, you see it in Trinidad and Tobago, you see it, frankly, sometimes in the United States as well. In my mind, you need strong institutions with good resources. You need technical capabilities. You need essentially to go after those people who are engaging in the corruptions. You need to go after the money flows, and frankly, you need to go after the leadership of the organization at the same time. If you don't do all of those things at once, you're going to continue to get that penetration. In other words, you have to make the body politic more resistant, that is, the TPS and others, while at the same time you also have to reduce the flows that are coming from the guns, from the money that are, undermining the TPS and other institutions.
My final question to you, Dr. Ellis. If nothing fundamentally changes within the next 5 years, what does the trajectory of crime in this country really look like?
Well, I think, frankly, there are a lot of reasons to be hopeful. I think the trajectory for the long term for Venezuela and its connection to the economy of Trinidad and Tobago is relatively positive if things remain stable from the perspective of oil and even joint oil projects and the Trinidad and Tobago oil sector. So I think those prospects for economic improvement will also give more resources and decrease some of the pressures regarding criminality. My sense also is the greater U.S. attention to those direct criminal flows across the Caribbean will tend to take some of the pressures off Trinidad and Tobago and really the greater security focus on the Caribbean in general. I think also, working with the U.S., but also working with the Europeans and other partners to try to continue to strengthen institutions. I know that, sometimes there have been, difficulty, but I also have had the privilege of working with people over the years from, the TTPS, and I have a great deal of respect for some of the capability that's there. So I think with the right resources, with the right direction, with the right partnerships, there's every reason to think that things could and should continue to get better.
The violence may dominate the headlines, but as we've heard tonight, the roots of crime run far deeper, requiring more than short-term measures or reactive policies. My thanks to you, Dr. Ellis, for your insight and perspective. Join us next time as we go beyond the headlines. I'm Urvashi Tiwari Roopnarine. Thank you for watching. Good night. There's more news after the break.